Under pressure from investors, the millionaire needed a fake wife to save his company, and his only option was the cleaning lady. He offered her a fortune to pretend to be his fiancée, expecting her to accept the money without hesitation. To his surprise, she accepted the proposal but refused the money. Instead, she took a document from her bag and placed it on the table. It wasn't a request. It was a contract with a single condition. Upon reading the condition she imposed for the fake marriage, the millionaire's world was turned upside down. The grandfather clock in the corner of Arthur Pierce's office chimed with the precision of a death sentence. Each tick was a second lost, a grain of sand slipping through the hourglass of his destiny. Outside, New York City spread out like a carpet of shimmering lights, a kingdom he commanded from the top of his skyscraper, but one that in 7 days might no longer be his. The glass of whiskey in his hand trembled slightly, the amber liquid reflecting the anguish on his face. On the polished mahogany desk, the document sealing his doom seemed to mock him, his grandfather's will. The clause was archaic, cruel, and underlined in red ink by the family lawyer, the unyielding Mr. Caldwell. To assume the presidency of the empire built by generations, the vast fortune in assets and stocks that spanned continents, Arthur needed to be stably married before his 40th birthday. A birthday that was exactly 7 days away. The word stably seemed to dance before him, a ghost of his late wife, the love of his life, taken from him far too soon. Since her passing, his existence had been reduced to 2 things: relentless work and his little daughter, Leah, the only ray of sunshine in his grey days. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The board would meet on Friday. Mr. Caldwell, a man forged in tradition and suspicion, would be there to ensure every comma of his grandfather's wish was honored. Arthur rubbed his temples, a headache throbbing. A wife. Where on earth was he supposed to find a wife in 1 week? His mind, accustomed to analyzing cash flow and the profitability of complex investments, ran through the options with the coldness of a computer. Friends from his social circle. Impossible. News of an arranged marriage would leak to the press before the invitations were even printed, turning his family's legacy into a media circus. Hire an actress. Too risky. The chance of blackmail, of a scandal, was too great. His reputational capital was as valuable as his assets. He looked at the picture frame of Leah on his desk, her smile the only thing keeping him from crumbling. He wasn't just fighting for a fortune, he was fighting for her future, for the stability he had sworn to give her. Desperation was a bitter taste in his mouth. He walked to the massive plate glass window, watching the reflection of his own tired face superimposed over the illuminated city. And that's when he saw her. Not in the city below, but in the reflection behind him. A silent figure, moving with quiet grace through the vast office. It was Isabella, the woman who cleaned the executive floor on the night shift. He saw her almost every night, but he had never truly seen her. A quiet, nearly invisible woman, always wearing earbuds, oblivious to the world of wealth and power around her. But tonight, he noticed something different. There was a dignity in her posture, a restrained strength in her methodical movements, and in her eyes, for a brief instant when they met in the reflection, he saw a deep sadness, a loneliness that echoed his own. He knew, from a casual comment a security guard had made, that she was also a widow, that she worked 2 jobs to support her sick mother. She was loyal, discreet, and above all, invisible to his world. She was the only option. The idea was insane, a high-risk investment with the potential for complete ruin, but it was the only play he had left. He watched her for another moment, the vacuum cleaner humming softly, a banal soundtrack for the most important decision of his life. The decision, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, took shape in his mind. He turned, his heart racing, and opened his mouth to call her Isabella. Arthur's voice cut through the monotonous hum of the vacuum. She turned, switching off the machine, and a thick, uncomfortable silence filled the space between them. Her eyes, large and brown, regarded him with a neutral, perhaps slightly tired expression. He had never spoken to her beyond a hurried, "Good evening." His heart pounded, the insanity of his plan becoming palpable. He gestured toward one of the leather armchairs facing his desk. "Please, sit down. I need to speak with you about something urgent." Confusion flickered across her face, but she walked over and sat on the edge of the chair, hands folded in her lap, her posture erect and dignified. Arthur sat in his own chair, feeling strangely intimidated. This was his territory, the center of his power, where he moved millions in capital and decided the fate of international deals. But before this quiet woman, he felt like a complete fool. He decided on the direct approach, the only one he knew. "Isabella, I'll be blunt. I'm in a desperate situation, and you are my only option." He paused, watching her, no reaction. She just waited, patient. "My grandfather left a clause in his will for me to take over as president of this company and protect my family's inheritance. I need to be married by next Friday." He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, the first crack in her serene facade. "Obviously, that's impossible under conventional terms. What I need is an arrangement, a business transaction." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I need a pretend wife, and I want it to be you." The silence that followed was so profound, Arthur could hear the electricity humming in the walls. Isabella blinked once, twice, as if trying to process a foreign language. A slow blush crept up her neck. "Sir," she began, her voice a whisper, "I don't think I understand." "It's a contract," he said quickly, feeling his control of the situation slipping through his fingers. "For 1 week of your time, for pretending to be my fiancée in front of the board of directors, I'm offering you a sum of money that would change your life. I know about your situation, your mother. This would cover all of her treatments, buy a house, secure your future, a fortune for anyone." He hated the sound of his own words, the way they reduced her dignity to a number. For the first time, Isabella's face tightened, not in greed, but in profound offense. She stood, her posture rigid. "With all due respect, sir, my life is not for sale. My dignity doesn't have a price tag." She turned to leave, her wounded pride radiating from her. Panic seized Arthur. "Wait," he pleaded, standing as well. "Please, this isn't about buying your dignity. It's about saving my daughter's future." The mention of Leah made her stop. She turned slowly, the anger in her eyes giving way to a painful exhaustion. She studied him for a long moment, seeing past the billionaire to the desperate father. The clock on the wall chimed the hour. Time was running out. Isabella remained standing, her hands still on the doorknob, her body as tense as a violin string. The mention of Arthur's daughter had changed everything. She, who knew the depth of parental love and the sacrifice it demanded, couldn't just ignore that plea. The image of her own mother, frail in the bed of their small apartment, flooded her mind. The medical bills were piling up like a mountain of dirty snow, threatening to bury them. Arthur's proposal was an insult, an absurdity, but the amount he had whispered, almost ashamed, was more than a solution. It was a miracle. It was the difference between constant fear and peace, between precarity and security. She let go of the doorknob and turned to face him fully, the conflict warring on her face. What exactly would I have to do?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Arthur felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. He explained the plan in detail. A dinner with the board's attorney, the final meeting, perhaps a few public events. Everything would be choreographed, rehearsed, a script to save his empire. She listened in silence, absorbing every word. The plan was risky, but simple in its essence. His world of fortune and power was so far removed from hers that the chance of anyone discovering the sham was minimal. She was, as he himself had thought, invisible. When he finished, she was quiet for a long minute. Arthur didn't press her. He saw the battle waging inside her, dignity versus necessity, pride versus filial love. Finally, she lifted her chin, and the hesitation in her eyes was replaced by a cool determination that surprised him. "I'll do it," she said. Arthur felt the air return to his lungs, but she continued, raising a single finger. "On my terms." He nodded quickly. "Of course, anything." He expected a renegotiation of the payment. Demands for jewelry, clothes, guarantees. What came next left him utterly speechless. "I'll do it," she repeated, her voice clear and steady. "But this agreement will not be drawn up by your lawyer. It will be drawn up by mine. And we will have a prenuptial agreement that protects your company, your daughter, and above all, my dignity." Arthur stared at her, stunned. Her lawyer. The cleaning woman working 2 jobs had a lawyer on speed dial. The woman he had assumed was simple, perhaps even naive, was dictating the legal terms of their billion-dollar arrangement. The complexity of his net worth, the structure of his assets and liabilities, were matters for the most expensive law firms in the country. The thought of submitting it to the scrutiny of some unknown attorney was reckless. But looking at the resolute seriousness on her face, he realized he had no choice. He had grossly underestimated the woman standing before him. "All right," he agreed, curiosity now overriding his shock. "Your lawyer?" She gave him a short nod, as if sealing the deal. "He'll be in touch with your team tomorrow." Without another word, she turned and left, leaving Arthur alone in his opulent office, feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had just shifted. The next day, an email arrived in the inbox of Arthur's head of legal. It was from a small, almost unknown law firm, representing the interests of one Isabella Morales. Arthur's team, accustomed to dealing with corporate giants, exchanged dismissive glances. They anticipated an amateur document, a list of absurd demands they could easily swat down. When the attachment was opened, however, the dismissal turned into shocked silence. The document that appeared on the screen was no amateur's work. It was a masterpiece. The prenuptial agreement Isabella's lawyer had drafted was more meticulous, more detailed, and offered more protection for Arthur's assets than anything his own team of elite attorneys had considered. It not only shielded his personal wealth and family inheritance, but delved into intricate details of corporate structure, the protection of minority shareholders, and the stability of the company's cash flow in the event of a public divorce. The head of legal, a gray-haired man with 30 years of experience, called Arthur immediately. "I don't know who this woman's lawyer is, Arthur, but he's a genius, or she is." He read a few of the clauses aloud. There was one stipulating that Isabella's payment would be classified as a consulting fee for strategic representation services, sidestepping any legal implication of a marital settlement and protecting company capital from future claims. Another clause detailed how dividends from Arthur's shares would be reinvested during the marriage to ensure market confidence. It was brilliant. But the clause that made Arthur sit up straight was the last one. It waived any right to alimony or division of assets as expected. However, it stipulated non-negotiably that 40% of the agreed-upon payment was to be transferred directly into a legally established trust fund in Leah's name, earmarked for her future education and well-being. The money would not pass through Isabella's hands. It would go straight to Arthur's daughter. Arthur hung up the phone, his mind reeling. The woman he had treated as an employee, a convenient solution, possessed a strategic acumen that rivaled the men he paid millions to advise him. She wasn't trying to extort him. She was protecting him. She was protecting his daughter. The realization hit him like a cold wave. He knew absolutely nothing about Isabella. The image he had of her, the quiet, sad cleaning woman, shattered, revealing something far more complex and intriguing underneath. He picked up the phone again, not to call his lawyers, but the number she had provided. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and professional. "Hello?" He didn't know what to say. Questions tumbled through his mind. "The contract is accepted," he said, his voice hoarse. "And no changes?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I figured it would be," she replied simply. Arthur took a deep breath, the need to understand overriding everything else. "Isabella," he said, "I have to ask you a question. Who are you, really?" Arthur's question hung in the air, laden with unexpected weight. On the other end of the line, Isabella hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to dredge up the past, especially to a man who was, essentially, her employer in a bizarre transaction. "I'm the woman you hired to solve a problem," she answered finally, her voice guarded, professional. But Arthur wasn't satisfied. "No, the contract you presented, that's not the work of an ordinary person. And the clause about Leah, why?" He heard a soft sigh, a sound of resignation. "My late husband, Eduardo," she said, the name still causing a familiar pang of pain, "was a corporate lawyer, one of the most brilliant I ever knew. He believed the law should be a tool to protect, not to exploit. He taught me a lot." In that moment, Arthur caught a glimpse of the life she had lost, a world of intellectual ambition and partnership. A swift, painful flashback assaulted her. Eduardo poring over books at their small kitchen table, explaining the intricacies of a merger clause with an infectious enthusiasm, treating her not as a layman, but as his equal. "Oh, do you have a mind for this, Bella?" he used to say. "You see things from angles no one else does." That mind was now being used to clean offices and secure her mother's medical care. "He would have protected your daughter," she told Arthur, her voice cracking with an emotion she couldn't hide. "It's what decent people do." In that instant, Arthur felt a deep, unexpected connection to this woman. He too knew the pain of loss, the void left by a love gone too soon. "Oh dear, I'm sorry," he said, and the words were more sincere than anything he had said in years. "I lost my wife too. It's why Leah's future is the only thing that matters." The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was a space of shared understanding. "We need to prepare," Arthur said, changing the subject, feeling he was treading on sacred ground. "Mr. Caldwell is a sharp man. He'll be looking for any flaw." In the hours that followed, they began to build the foundation of their charade. Over the phone, he told her about his tastes, his hobbies, mostly business-related, his favorite places. She listened, memorizing the details. Late in the afternoon, he insisted she come to his penthouse so they could rehearse in person. The situation was absurdly awkward. They stood in Arthur's vast living room, the sun setting over the city, trying to practice the body language of a couple. "Maybe we should try holding hands," he suggested, feeling like a teenager on a first date. He held out his hand. She took it, her skin soft but her hands calloused from work. An electric current shot up his arm. It was just a touch, but it felt dangerously real. It was at that exact moment a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Daddy, who's that lady?" Leah stood there, her wide blue eyes fixed on their joined hands, a cloth doll dangling from her arm. Arthur's world stopped. Isabella's hand dropped his as if she'd been burned. Seeing Leah there, so small and vulnerable, watching them with innocent curiosity, turned the business charade into a profound moral crisis. How could he possibly explain this to a 6-year-old who still cried for her mother? "Honey," he began, his voice strained, "this is Isabella. She's a friend of Daddy's." The explanation sounded weak, even to his own ears. Leah tilted her head, her eyes still on Isabella, not with suspicion, but with the serious appraisal only children possess. Arthur braced himself for a flood of questions, maybe even tears, but to his surprise, it was Isabella who acted. She moved with a natural grace, kneeling to be on Leah's level, the smile on her face soft and genuine, without a trace of the moment's tension. "Hello, Leah. It's so nice to finally meet you. Your daddy talks about you all the time." Isabella's voice was warm, a gentle melody that seemed to soothe the charged air. Leah took a hesitant step forward. "You're pretty," she said quietly, touching the fabric of Isabella's simple dress. "Thank you, sweetheart. So are you." "And who's this?" Isabella asked, noticing the doll. "Her name is Star. Mommy made her for me," Leah replied, clutching the doll tightly. Arthur's heart clenched. He saw Isabella's eyes fill with a deep compassion. "She's beautiful. Your mommy must have been very special to make such a bright star." Isabella showed no pity, only a gentle understanding that seemed to reach Leah in a way no one else could. They talked for a few more minutes about dolls and cartoons, and Arthur watched, mesmerized. Leah, who had become so withdrawn since her mother's death, was opening up to this stranger in a way he never would have expected. The interaction was both a balm and a torment. Seeing his daughter smile was all he wanted, but knowing it was built on a foundation of lies filled him with guilt. Isabella's presence in the apartment over the next few days became a complicated fact. She and Leah developed a quick, natural bond. Isabella helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and her soft laughter began to fill the silent rooms of the penthouse. To Leah, she was a gentle, comforting female presence. To Arthur, she was an emotional complication he didn't know how to manage. The arrangement was becoming dangerously personal. The future of his multi-billion-dollar estate now seemed almost secondary to the delicate emotional balance of his home. With the board meeting just days away, the pressure mounted. Every rehearsed moment of complicity between him and Isabella felt more real, and every smile exchanged with Leah more deceptive. It was one evening, as they were going over the final details of their love story, that Arthur's phone rang. It was a number he knew all too well. The voice on the other end was formal, courteous, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Arthur, Caldwell here. I heard the wonderful news about your engagement. My congratulations. Would you and your fiancée be so kind as to join me for an informal dinner tomorrow evening?" "I would so love to meet her before the meeting." Arthur's stomach plummeted. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. The trap was set. The restaurant Mr. Caldwell had chosen was the kind of place where silence was worth more than the gold in the chandeliers. Waiters moved like shadows, and the clinking of silver was the only sound to break the solemn atmosphere. Arthur felt every eye on them as he guided Isabella to the table where the old lawyer awaited them. Caldwell greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his shrewd eyes. He kissed Isabella's hand with old-fashioned courtesy, but his gaze was that of a predator sizing up its prey. The dinner began with pleasantries, talk of the stock market, the weather, the vintage of the wine. Arthur clung to the script he and Isabella had rehearsed, describing a chance meeting at an art gallery, shared interests, a romance that blossomed quietly. He could feel sweat beading on his brow. Every word felt false, hollow. But Isabella was another story. She wasn't just reciting lines, she was weaving a narrative. When Caldwell turned to her, asking what a woman like her saw in a man as business-focused as Arthur, she didn't hesitate. "I see the man he is when he's not in the boardroom," she said, her voice calm and filled with a surprising conviction. "I see the father who reads the same story to his daughter every night, even though he already knows the words by heart. I see the man who worries about the legacy he'll leave, not just in terms of profit, but in terms of honor. We didn't connect over his business, Mr. Caldwell. We connected over the values we share." Arthur stared at her, mesmerized. She wasn't lying. She was using the truths she had observed about him over the last week, to paint a completely authentic picture. She wasn't describing the start of their fake relationship, but the essence of the relationship that was, dangerously, becoming real. With every question from Caldwell, she responded with a blend of emotional intelligence and sincerity that disarmed him. She spoke of the importance of family, of how two people who had known loss could find solace in each other. Arthur realized, with a shock that ran through him, that he wasn't acting anymore. He was listening, learning about himself through her eyes. The turning point wasn't a dramatic moment, but a quiet realization that settled over him during that dinner. The woman sitting beside him wasn't a solution to a problem. She was intelligent, compassionate, and unbelievably strong. And to his absolute terror, he was falling for her. The pretend wife was becoming the only woman he could imagine a real future with. The dinner ended, and Caldwell, though still reserved, seemed satisfied. Isabella's performance had been flawless. As they walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air enveloping them, Arthur felt a surge of hope. Maybe they could pull this off. Maybe everything would be okay. It was then that Caldwell, as an afterthought, turned to them at the door. "You know, my dear," he said to Isabella, "there's something about you that's strangely familiar. A look, perhaps. You remind me of someone, but I can't quite place who." Mr. Caldwell's words echoed in the car during the silent ride home. "You remind me of someone." The casually spoken phrase hung between Arthur and Isabella like a veiled threat. For Arthur, it was a sign that the ice beneath his feet was thinner than he'd imagined. For Isabella, it was a ghost from a past she kept under lock and key. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted after the dinner. The formality was gone, replaced by a heightened awareness of each other's presence. The line between the charade and reality was dissolving, leaving them in a dangerous, uncharted territory. They spent the next day, the last before the board meeting, in a sort of tense limbo. The conversations were no longer about the script or the strategy. Instead, they found themselves sharing stories. Driven by a need to understand her, Arthur asked about her dreams. She blushed slightly, surprised by the personal question. "It's silly," she said. "Indulge me," he replied, his voice soft. She then told him of her desire to open a small, second-hand bookstore, a cozy place where people could get lost among the pages, with the smell of coffee and old paper in the air. It was a small dream, but she spoke of it with a passion that lit up her face, and Arthur saw the woman she might have been if life hadn't dealt her so many burdens. In return, moved by a newfound vulnerability, he confessed his own abandoned dream. Before being pushed into the world of finance and profit margins, he had wanted to be an architect. He described his fascination with structures, with how spaces could shape people's lives, a creative desire he had buried under layers of spreadsheets and P&L reports. They were discovering each other, piece by piece, and each revelation strengthened the connection they were both trying to deny. He found himself admiring not just her intelligence, but her resilience, her unwavering kindness. She, in turn, began to see past the calculating billionaire to a lonely man, burdened by the weight of a legacy, a father who loved his daughter above any fortune. The attraction between them was a constant subtext, an electric current in every prolonged glance, every accidental touch. Arthur's wish for this marriage to be real became a dull ache in his chest, an impossible desire that made the lie even harder to bear. That afternoon, as he worked in his home office, Isabella came in to tidy the room. Her movements were quiet, efficient, but he felt her presence in every corner of the space. Her eyes drifted to Arthur's desk, landing on a silver picture frame he kept turned toward himself. It was a photo of his late wife, smiling in the sun. Isabella picked up the frame with a reverent gentleness. Arthur held his breath, expecting a reaction of awkwardness or perhaps jealousy. Instead, when she turned to him, her eyes held nothing but a deep, sad empathy, an understanding that seemed to reach beyond their situation. "She was beautiful," Isabella said softly, and in those simple words, Arthur felt a comfort he hadn't experienced in years. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a grey, oppressive sky that perfectly matched the knot in Arthur's stomach. His family's empire, a conglomerate of businesses and financial holdings stretching across the globe, was on the line. But strangely, his biggest anxiety wasn't about losing his billion-dollar inheritance. It was for Isabella. He felt an overwhelming desire to protect her from the scrutiny of those men in suits, to shield her from a world that didn't deserve her. As he adjusted his tie for the 10th time, feeling it tighten like a noose, she appeared at his bedroom door. Arthur turned, and the words died in his throat. She wore no expensive jewelry or designer gown. Instead, she'd chosen a simple, navy blue dress with a classic cut that fit her with understated elegance. Her hair was swept into a low, sophisticated bun, and her only makeup was a touch of color on her lips. The transformation was stunning, not because of the clothes, but because of the aura of calm and power she radiated. She didn't look like a cleaning woman playing a part. She looked like a queen about to claim her birthright. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice huskier than he intended. "We're ready," she corrected, and her quiet smile was a balm to his frayed nerves. She walked over and, with a gesture that felt both intimate and natural, straightened the collar of his shirt. The brush of her fingers on his neck sent a shiver down his spine. "Just be yourself, Arthur." Leah's father, the man who dreamed of building beautiful things. They need to see that man, not just the CEO. Her insight into him, her ability to see through his defenses, left him completely vulnerable. The drive to the company skyscraper was made in a loaded silence. Arthur drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Beside him, Isabella looked out the window, serene. As they stopped at a red light a block from the building, she turned to him. Seeing the tension in his jaw, the anxiety in his eyes, she did something unexpected. She reached out and placed her hand gently over his on the steering wheel. The touch was warm, firm, an anchor in his sea of anxiety. "We've got this," she said, and for the first time, the word "we" didn't feel like part of a charade. It felt like a promise. He took a deep breath, drawing on her strength. The light turned green. He drove the final block. He pulled up to the building's imposing entrance and handed the key to the valet. He got out and opened the door for her. As Isabella emerged from the car, lifting her chin with a regal grace, Arthur felt a surge of pride so intense it startled him. He offered his arm. She took it. Together, they walked up the marble steps and through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was hushed, the few people present stopping to watch them. They walked toward the private elevator that would take them to the boardroom. As they stepped into the steel and glass cabin and the doors slid shut, sealing them off from the rest of the world, they turned to face the mirror. The image that stared back was of a power couple, united, flawless, a perfect lie. The doors opened on the executive floor. They stepped out and walked down the silent, carpeted hall. The boardroom door was just ahead. Arthur paused, took one last deep breath, and pushed it open. 12 pairs of eyes, including those of an impassive Mr. Caldwell, turned in their direction. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy as stone. They entered the boardroom, a sanctuary of power and wealth where fortunes were made and unmade with a signature. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the long, polished conference table reflected the stern faces of the board members. They were the guardians of his family's legacy, men who measured the world's worth in interest rates, dividends, and stock prices. Arthur introduced Isabella with a steady voice that belied the nervousness he felt. "Gentlemen, this is Isabella Morales, my fiancée." Isabella greeted them all with a nod, her expression calm and composed. She sat beside Arthur, not as an accessory, but as a partner. The meeting began, focused on quarterly reports and market projections. Arthur answered questions with his usual competence, but he could feel the board's attention divided between him and the silent woman at his side. They were testing her, sizing her up. Finally, one of the oldest members, a man named Mr. Sterling, addressed her directly. "Mrs. Morales, do you understand the magnitude of this empire, the responsibility that comes with this family's name?" The question was condescending, designed to intimidate. Arthur prepared to intervene, but Isabella answered before he could. "I do, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet room. "I understand that this empire was built on more than just good investment sense. It was built on values, on the idea that true wealth lies not just in the assets we accumulate, but in the impact we have on people's lives." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping over each board member. "Arthur told me about his grandfather's vision, one that went beyond the bottom line, a vision of building communities, of creating opportunities. I believe the future of this company lies not just in expanding its net worth in dollars or euros, but in expanding its human worth." A murmur went through the room. She wasn't just answering a question. She was presenting a vision, one that echoed the company's founding principles, which many there had forgotten in their pursuit of higher returns. She spoke of creating a philanthropic foundation, not as a PR stunt, but as a central pillar of the business. She spoke with a passion and intelligence that was impossible to fake. Arthur watched her, utterly awestruck. He wasn't seeing the cleaning woman he'd hired. He wasn't seeing an actress playing a role. He was seeing a natural-born leader, a strategist with a heart who could guide his company toward a better, more meaningful future. The board members, once skeptical, were now listening with genuine respect. She had won them over, not with falsehoods, but with a powerful truth about what their company could and should be. All the while, Mr. Caldwell remained silent, elbows on the table, fingertips pressed together under his chin, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. His expression was unreadable. Finally, when she finished and a respectful silence settled, Caldwell's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous. "This is all very inspiring, but I have one last question, if I may. A personal curiosity. Where exactly did such a distinguished couple meet?" Caldwell's question dropped into the room like a stone in a still pond, the ripples of tension spreading instantly. It was the question they had feared most, the loose thread that could unravel the entire tapestry. The air grew thick, and Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The rehearsed story of the art gallery, which had seemed so plausible over dinner, now sounded flimsy and transparent under the harsh lights of the boardroom. His lawyers had coached him to lie with conviction, to sell a narrative with the same skill he used to sell a billion-dollar business idea. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver the performance of a lifetime. But Isabella's hand found his under the table, a gentle squeeze that silenced him. He looked at her and saw something in her eyes that wasn't panic. It was calm. It was strategy. She turned to face Mr. Caldwell, and a sad, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. The entire room leaned forward, captivated. "We met through grief, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a melancholy that silenced any skeptical thought. "We both lost the person we loved most, and when you go through something like that, you learn to recognize the same pain in others. You don't need words." The answer was brilliant in its evasion and its emotional depth. It was true in its essence, and it resonated with an authenticity no lie could ever replicate. Arthur stared at her, his heart pounding with both admiration and fear. She was walking a tightrope with no safety net, but she wasn't finished. She held her gaze on Caldwell, creating an intimate connection that excluded everyone else in the room. "My late husband," she continued, her voice growing softer, more personal, "was a young lawyer. He always spoke of you with immense admiration. He saw you as a mentor, even from a distance. He said you were a paragon of integrity and love for the law." The air in the room grew even thinner. Arthur had no idea where she was going with this, but he felt he was witnessing a chess master make a move in a game he could barely comprehend. The mention of her late husband, the detail of his admiration, it all felt dangerously specific. Caldwell's facade wavered. His skepticism, his suspicion, was momentarily replaced by a genuine curiosity. He leaned forward, the mask of the ruthless attorney slipping. "Your husband, he was a lawyer?" he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. "Yes," Isabella replied, "one of the good ones." Arthur held his breath. The entire room seemed to have done the same. The fate of his inheritance, his future, all of it balanced on the razor's edge of these words. Caldwell, now pale and visibly intrigued, asked the inevitable question, the question that would seal all their fates. "And what was his name?" "Eduardo," Isabella answered. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. But in the absolute stillness of the boardroom, the name resonated like a thunderclap. Eduardo Morales. The effect on Mr. Caldwell was immediate and devastating. The color drained from his face, leaving it the pallor of ancient marble. He fell back in his chair as if he'd taken a physical blow, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the polished table to steady himself. His mouth opened and closed without a sound, the facade of the implacable lawyer, the executioner of Arthur's fate, crumbled completely, revealing an old man, shocked and heartbroken. "Eduardo," he whispered, the name an exhalation of disbelief and pain. His eyes, once sharp and skeptical, were now glazed over, lost in a distant memory. He looked up at Isabella, no longer seeing Arthur's fiancée, the woman under investigation, but the living relic of one of his greatest sources of pride and perhaps regret. "He was my best student," Caldwell said, his voice thick with emotion, speaking more to himself than to the room. "My protégé, brilliant, the most promising of his generation. I saw him as a son." The silence in the room was so profound it seemed to have a physical presence. The other board members exchanged confused, shocked glances, witnessing the emotional unraveling of the man who had always been the group's pillar of strength and tradition. For Arthur, the world had turned upside down. The floor beneath him had vanished. The woman he had hired in an act of desperation, the cleaning woman he had seen as a simple solution, was connected in the deepest, most unimaginable way to the man who held power over his future. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a charade. It was a coincidence so astronomical, a truth so shocking, that it surpassed any fiction they could have invented. It was fate, in its most ironic and overwhelming form. He looked at Isabella with a new reverence, the quiet strength he had admired, the strategic intelligence that had shocked him. It all made sense now. She had been the partner of a man like Eduardo Morales. She had been his equal. The lawyer took several moments to compose himself. He drew a long, shuddering breath. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his figure still imposing, but the rigidity replaced by a human fragility. He didn't look at Arthur. His eyes, now misty with unshed tears, were fixed on Isabella in a mixture of sorrow, respect, and perhaps even gratitude. He cleared his throat, the harsh sound echoing in the room. He turned to the board, to the faces awaiting his verdict, his final decision. The future of the multi-billion-dollar empire, the succession, the clause in the will. It all came down to this moment, to the next words that would come from the old, shaken lawyer's mouth. Mr. Caldwell looked at each board member, his gaze conveying a renewed authority, born not of rigid law, but of the weight of emotion and conviction. "I knew Eduardo Morales," he declared, his voice firm, though still laden with feeling. "I knew his character, his integrity, and his brilliance. A man like that would not have loved a woman who did not share his deepest values." He turned to Arthur and Isabella, who remained seated, their hands still clasped under the table. "I have no further questions. I have no doubts about the legitimacy of this union, nor about Mr. Pierce's fitness, with the support of a woman of such caliber, to lead this company into the future." With that declaration, any opposition in the room evaporated. The vote was a mere formality. Arthur Pierce was confirmed as the new chairman of the board. The empire was secure. The charade was over, but the victory felt strangely hollow. That evening, Arthur's vast penthouse was quieter than ever. The tension of the week had dissipated, leaving behind an awkward, uncomfortable stillness. The purpose that had united them, the contract, the lie, no longer existed. Isabella was in one of the guest rooms, packing her few belongings into a small suitcase. She had fulfilled her part of the deal. It was time to go back to her life, to her mother, to her 2 jobs. Arthur stood in his office, the check for the agreed-upon amount lying on his desk, a life-changing sum, the payment for her services. But looking at that piece of paper filled him with a sense of disgust. To pay her now felt like an insult, an attempt to put a price on the dignity, intelligence, and grace with which she had saved him. To reduce everything that had happened between them to a simple financial transaction seemed the greatest of all profanities. He walked to the guest room and found her zipping the suitcase shut. Their eyes met, and in her gaze he saw no triumph or expectation, only a quiet sadness. "Thank you, Isabella," he said, his voice low. "You didn't just save my inheritance. You showed me so much more." She gave a small smile. "I'm glad everything worked out for you and your daughter." The "you" hit him like a blow. He didn't want a "you" and "I" anymore. He wanted the "we" she had mentioned in the car, the "we" he had begun to feel as a truth. "Don't go," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Stay." She looked at him, confused. "The contract is over, Arthur." "I'm not talking about the contract," he said, taking a step toward her. "The check, the money, it was all irrelevant. I don't want to pay you. I want to know you, for real. No lies, no scripts." He hesitated, his heart vulnerable for the first time in years. "Please tell me about him. Tell me about Eduardo. Tell me about you." The request was simple, yet it carried everything that had gone unsaid between them. It was a plea for truth, for connection, for a new beginning. Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching his, seeking the sincerity amidst the complexities of the past week. And then, slowly, she nodded. She sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time, began to tell him her story, her real story. And as he listened, Arthur knew that the contractual arrangement had indeed ended, but the most important negotiation of his life, the one for his own heart, was just beginning. The weeks that followed transformed Arthur's silent penthouse into a home. Isabella stayed. The suitcase was unpacked and put away. Her mother was moved to the best hospital in the city, her treatments covered not by a payout, but as a family matter. A responsibility Arthur took on with quiet joy. Isabella's presence in the house was like sunlight pouring into a long, shuttered room. She brought life, laughter, and the smell of cake baking on Sundays. Her relationship with Leah blossomed into a deep, genuine love. They spent hours reading in the garden, building blanket forts in the living room, and Leah's laughter, once a rarity, became the soundtrack of the home. Arthur found himself leaving the office earlier, not out of obligation, but out of an eager desire to get home, to hear about their day, to simply be in their presence. True to her word, Isabella became a transformative force at the company. Arthur appointed her director of the newly created philanthropic foundation. Her vision and sharp intellect, once used to decipher contracts, were now applied to create social impact programs, changing the corporate culture from the inside out. She wasn't the chairman's wife. She was a leader in her own right, respected and admired by everyone, including the board members who had once looked at her with skepticism. Their evenings were filled with conversation. She told him about Eduardo, about their young love and the dreams they had shared. He spoke about his wife, about the grief and guilt he carried. In the vulnerability of those confessions, they found a common ground of healing and understanding. He discovered that love wasn't a finite resource. The heart had an infinite capacity to expand. One evening, months later, Arthur went into Leah's room to kiss her goodnight. He found Isabella sitting beside the bed, finishing a story. Leah was already asleep, her face serene, one hand holding Isabella's. The scene struck him with the force of a revelation. This was his family, not a family born from a contract, but one forged in honesty, respect, and a coincidence that could only be described as fate. He waited for Isabella in the hall. When she came out, closing the door softly, he took her hand, leading her out to the balcony overlooking the city lights. "I've spent my entire life making deals," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide, analyzing risk, calculating the return on investment, and I can say, with absolute certainty, that the greatest and most profitable investment I ever made was the desperate gamble I took that night in my office. He turned to face her, his eyes shining in the moonlight. "The contract ended a long time ago, Isabella, but I'd like to make you a new proposal, one with no clauses, no lawyers, and no expiration date." He took both of her hands in his. "I love you. I love the woman you are, the mother you've become to my daughter, the partner who challenges me to be a better man. Marry me. For real, this time." A single tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, followed by a radiant smile that lit up the night. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." The shocking arrangement had not given him a pretend wife, but the only woman who could truly be the queen of his empire and beach, more importantly, of his heart. Together, they looked out at the city, not as a kingdom of business and capital, but as the backdrop for a future where their greatest asset would be the love they built on the most unexpected of truths.